Hello, everyone. I'm glad that you all got here through the rain. It's why we've started a little late to allow everyone to get through the muddy streets and the queues and so on. But it's wonderful to see such a full house, not at all surprising to me because I know what an interesting hour you're about to have. Richard Dawkins, the first part of an autobiography, An Appetite for Wonder. And I was commenting on Richard's great talent for titles. I mean, The Blind Watchmaker, River Out of Eden, Unweaving the Rainbow, Climbing Mount Impossible. Improbable, I beg your pardon. The God Delusion.
We're working on the impossible.
That's an indication of someone knows about language, knows about poetry, knows about literature, and of course, that's something of which Richard is very well informed, as well as being, as we know, a great scientist. So this is how it came about. You do say at one point, my childhood was as happy as a childhood could be. And I thought, what a wonderful gift that was to someone in their growing up, that they should have that background.
I think you only quoted the first half of that sentence. I think the second half was something like, my childhood was as happy as a childhood could be, given that.
Well, given that you weren't rich and you had to holiday in Wales instead of the Mediterranean, I think.
And the weather was approximately like this, only worse. And also that I was sent away to boarding school at the age of 7, which is not ideal for childhood happiness.
No, but what is interesting is, first of all, that your family were very loving, and also that they understood about science, and your father was clearly a very important figure, and also a very important botanist, zoologist, and knew about exactly what was going to fascinate you.
I think that's true. I think it's true that my father was an influence on me as a scientist. He was not a professional scientist. He'd read botany at Oxford, and then he went into the colonial service in the agriculture department. So he was a practicing agricultural scientist, but he wasn't an academic scientist. But nevertheless, I think he imbued me with a sense of what science is about. And both he and my mother were keen on botany, and so when we went for walks, they'd point out flowers and tell me. My father would tell me the Latin name, my mother would tell me the English name. And so I think I got a feel for what it's like to be a naturalist.
And that's very revealing, because as you tell it, it sounds as though he was an intuitively curious person investigating everything that came his way. And for a small child, that must have been wonderful.
He was very good with his hands. He was very good at making things, very good at improvising, which I'm not. And I think rather to his disappointment, a little bit later, they sent me to Oundle School, which was and probably still is the best school in the country for technology. And I think I was a great disappointment because I was never any good at making things, at improvising.
I doubt if he was disappointed in you.
Well, in that particular respect, but it was, in a way, it was a bad choice because the workshops are so good. You learned how to use a lathe and a milling machine and all sorts of fancy machine tools you'd never again see in your life. What I needed was what my father did, which was lash things up with string and dirty old bits of iron, and that's what he did, and I can't do that.
Now, you grew up in Kenya, and that must have been an extraordinary world at that time. And given your father's position, he was someone who had a role in the agricultural world there and what was happening. What was it like?
I was born in Kenya, but actually we moved a little further south to what was then Nyasaland, Malawi, which was where my father's career was, and moved around a bit in that country. Didn't really see the sort of Africa that you expect to see, didn't see giraffes and zebras and elephants and things, which is a shame. Saw great fields of tobacco plants and things like that, rather than the sort of natural history which you might expect.
But you saw the natural world that was there, and you also saw the people there.
Oh yes.
And that was very different from an English childhood.
Very different. It was a kind of throwback to, I suppose, a sort of Edwardian time, really. We had servants and There was no electric light, no water closet. We had earth closets, paraffin lamps that you pumped up like a Primus stove. But it was a pretty privileged life. You know, sort of tea was served on the lawn and beautiful silver teapots and things.
So you were the privileged class here?
Privileged, yes. It was sort of a bit like upstairs, downstairs, or Downton Abbey, but in an African setting.
And were you conscious of being sort of as upstairs as you could be in Kenyan society?
I think the upstairs, the parallel rather breaks down, actually. We're not talking aristocrats now.
No. The people in charge.
The people in charge. Yes, there was a fairly rigid racial separation. I would call it paternalistic. It wasn't vicious as like in apartheid South Africa, but it was paternalistic and you could say patronizing.
And did the growing boy notice that? Did you wonder how it came about?
Well, not really, no. I mean, all the male Africans were called boys. You know, it was that kind of thing.
Mm. Now, then, of course, the family came to England, and you went to, first of all, a traditional prep school, and then you went to Anvil. You write about bullying and the way boys were treated. You yourself were not a victim, but you lived in a community in which bullying was endemic.
I suspect that it's pretty bad in most childhood communities in different ways. I don't know whether it's right to suggest that bullying is something that most children go through and then we grow out of it, except in a few unpleasant cases like Nazis. But the way that boys treated other boys, and I suspect maybe still do, was pretty unpleasant. Sort of mass taunting. There was one I went to a prep school in what was then Southern Rhodesia at the age of 7, and there was a boy there called Auntie Peggy, and I don't know why he picked up that nickname, but it was enough to have people taunt him mercilessly. And so they would sort of dance, rather like Lord of the Flies. I mean,
yes.
Dancing around him in a circle, chanting, Auntie Peggy, Auntie Peggy. And the poor boy was demented with fury, and he would rush at people in the circle and fight them. And then we'd all gather round and watch this fight. It was a terrible, but I think that's not untypical.
Well, not untypical. Do you think it's something in the human nature?
That's what I was wondering about. I mean, something that is part of childhood nature that we grow out of. I mean, I was neither bullied nor bullied, but I reproach myself for not having intervened. I mean, for not having done something about it. And
yes, the adult conscience.
Not feeling the empathy, yes.
Yes, but then that's when children are learning power play, isn't it? They're learning about the way the world's
I guess
power
that's right, yes.
situations work.
And leaders emerge and tend to gather around them disciples who curry favor. So it's an interesting anthropological world to be moving around in, I suppose.
Well, it's interesting too, because of course it links to all the science that you've done since, which is in many ways about behavior and how we come to be where we are and who we are. So the question arises, and you use the phrase yourself, what made you? Was it nature or nurture?
It's Shakespeare, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's not
a devil, a born devil, from The Tempest. Yeah. Well, it's a difficult, tricky question. It's much more tricky than many people realize. It's very difficult to work out, to tease apart the different contributions of genetics and environment. You can only really even consider it as the contribution to variation. You can actually ask, given a certain amount of variation in a population, how much of that is due to genes and how much of it is due to environment.
And can you make estimates for that?
You can, and one of the best ways of doing it is twin studies, where you take identical twins who have all the same genes, and you compare them with fraternal twins who are just like ordinary brothers and sisters. And so you know how much more in common monozygotic identical twins have with each other than fraternal twins have with each other. And then you say, how similar are pairs of identical twins with respect to musical ability, mathematical ability, height, weight, linguistic ability, religiosity, all these sorts of things. You can then say if identical twins are much more similar with respect to intelligence or mathematical ability or musical ability than fraternal twins are, then you've got a bit of a handle on the contribution of genes, especially in those rare but nevertheless existing cases where identical twins happen for one reason or another to have been reared apart. And there aren't that many cases. There are a few dozen cases which have been investigated where identical twins have been separated more or less at birth and then fostered on different homes and maybe never even met each other until later in life. And then you look and see how similar they are. And in some cases, it's pretty uncanny. But in other cases, they're quite different. And so you can actually measure the...
So you can see that the genes, you can almost feel that the genes are...
Yes. You can tell which sources of variation come from the genes by comparing identical twins with fraternal twins.
Well, so we've spoken about your family background, which is clearly very nurturing and loving. School, very supportive in many ways, because it offered a framework, even though elements of the framework you didn't like, it gave you security. So the growing boy was both confident and given opportunity to do the study you wanted.
I think that's putting it a bit kindly.
Well, perhaps you're a bit too kind in your book. Your book is is wonderful to read because it's so heartwarming. You don't feel this boy was tortured and...
no, I mean, that's right. I'm pretty nice about teachers and things like that. So I don't moan very much in it, that's true.
Would you like to have been unkinder?
Well,
this is your chance.
I don't know. No, I think I missed lots of opportunities at school. I think that Handel especially offered all sorts of things that I should have done, like join the astronomy club and look down a telescope and things of that sort. Peer pressure at school is terribly strong, and so one tends to just do whatever you need to do in order to be popular with your mates, and that can lead to sad missed opportunities.
So were there paths not taken in your life?
Yes.
You might have become a writer. I mean, you might have had a literary career because you're a very good writer.
Well, the last chapter of the book is sort of about paths not taken, or it's a bit like the Robert Frost fork in the road.
That's right.
I'm interested in the question, and I raise it in the last chapter, whether if a different path had been taken, there's a kind of magnetic pull that brings you back to where you would have been anyway. I mean, this thing about the path not taken, anybody can look back in their life and say, if I hadn't happened to, I don't know, miss a train on a particular day, then I would never have met my future husband. I mean, that kind of thing. That sort of thing happens all the time. We are incredibly lucky, or unlucky as the case may be, to be exactly where we are within our own life, but also, of course, getting conceived in the first place is a ludicrously improbable stroke of luck.
There's a rather colourful paragraph about that.
Is there?
Yes.
You mean the Aldous Huxley poem?
Yes, that's right, about the poem about the spermatozoa.
It's a lovely poem by Aldous Huxley. Shall I say it?
Yes, do.
A million spermatozoa, all of them alive. Out of their cataclysm, but one poor Noah dare hope to survive. And of that billion minus one might have chanced to be Shakespeare, another Newton, a new Donne. But the one was me. Shame to have ousted your betters thus, taking ark while the others remained outside. Better for all of us, froward homunculus, if you'd quietly died. And that happened not only in your parents' generation, but your grandparents, your 8 great-grandparents, your 16 great-great-grandparents, and so on. None of us have any right to be here at all.
Makes you feel rather smug, doesn't it?
Yes.
You speak about, you suggested that something like a magnet pulled you back
Yes.
to the path. Now, do you think in your case the magnet was stronger?
Well, the kind of thing I meant was that it was a rather improbable event that caused my parents to leave Africa when I was 7, when I was 8, nearly 8, and come to England. And my father expected to go back to Africa and make his career there. I would have gone on at school in Africa. Would I have ended up at Oxford? Would I have ended up beyond Oxford writing anything like the books that I wrote? At first sight, the obvious answer would be no. But then maybe this magnetic pull, maybe there is a sort of, something that pulls you back to a pathway, having taken one fork in the road, perforce, then perhaps there is something about our nature which pulls you back. And another example was when I finished at Oxford, I did a doctorate under Nico Tinbergen, who's a Nobel Prize-winning animal behaviorist, and I almost missed that opportunity and almost did a biochemical doctorate instead. So would I ever have written anything remotely like the books that I wrote? Possibly, yes, possibly with a slightly more biochemical slant. I might have ended up writing something like The Selfish Gene or The Blind Watchmaker. On the other hand, possibly not, and I think it's a genuinely interesting question.
But you use the phrase, something in one's nature that.
Yes.
It's almost metaphysical, that, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, when I say an interesting question, I didn't for a moment mean to imply it because it's me. I mean, anyone in this room could ask a similar question of themselves.
How we got where we are.
Yes.
And how can we get away from it? So, and also then, of course, you went to Oxford, and there was this group of people. Now, where were you all? I haven't got the name of the street.
Oh, Bevington Road.
Bevington Road.
Yes.
Now, Bevington Road was a hotbed of scientists. It sounded, you speak about creative camaraderie, but you were all working in very allied fields and borrowing advice, borrowing each other's knowledge. It sounds rather like Florence in the Renaissance.
I think it may be that everybody who's lucky enough to be a graduate student in a good research group gets that feeling. It's probably something you don't recapture later, this feeling of being, there's a satirical Betjeman poem. Objectively, our common room is like a small Athenian state. Except for Lewis, he's all right, but do you think he's quite first rate? Well, without the smugness.
But you were all pretty first-rate, there's no doubt about it when you look back on it now.
I think there is this sort of feeling that you get when you're in your 20s, that there's a sort of unique atmosphere, and maybe everybody gets that feeling.
But Bevington Road should have a plaque on it, really, shouldn't it, saying,
well, nice
it happened here?
Yes. Yeah.
And what came out of it, there was your work came out of it, but also allied to that, who were the other people who we might know?
Well, I'm not sure whether, Tinbergen himself, who died about 20 years ago now, won the Nobel Prize for physiology and medicine. My great guru, mentor, was Mike Cullen, and I think, printed in the book part of my eulogy for him, because he was a wonderful teacher and totally unselfish person who devoted himself to his students and to his colleagues, such that if only he had done what most scientists do, which is put their name on the papers of their students and co-workers, he would be, honored Fellow of the Royal Society and everything else. But as it was, he just did it unselfishly. His name appears on hardly any of them, although it ought to be there, and he ought to be a sung hero instead of an unsung hero.
Now, the book ends with The Selfish Gene, the arrival of the publication of The Selfish Gene, which is 76. But you trace back when the ideas began to happen. Indeed, you quote a paragraph from a lecture that you gave in Oxford in 1966,
yes,
which contained all the logical stages towards the selfish gene theory.
That's right. I found these lecture notes really quite recently, only just while I was writing An Appetite for Wonder. Notes from a lecture that I gave in 1966, as you say, and I had forgotten quite how, almost word for word, the rhetoric of the selfish gene is there. I use the word rhetoric not in a derogatory sense, but the sort of rhetoric of genes as sort of leaping down the generations like immortal chamois from crag to crag. That's not quite it, but I just... It's all there in that lecture, and then I didn't revive it again until 10 years later in The Selfish Gene.
Now, when you wrote it, first of all, did you recognize the potential of what you had actually written? Because these ideas were around at the time, weren't
Yes.
there? People were all beginning to put these ideas in different forms and different papers, and I wonder whether it was only when you came to write the book that it kind of came into focus as a concept.
Yes, as you say, these ideas were not new. I suppose all that was new was a rhetorical way of putting it. It was, I mean, what was familiar was the idea that, well, from Darwin onwards, really, that animals work for their own reproductive success rather than their own survival. Reproductive success means passing on genes. I suppose what I added was this sort of almost poetic image of genes as being immortal replicators that go on down through countless generations. And so what an individual organism is a machine for passing on those genes. That was the rhetorical flourish which I used in order to dramatize what ought to have been familiar.
Do you feel that idea, that concept, which is so easy to grasp, you pass on something and it goes through all your generations, has been abused in sort of popular interpretation? I mean, is there a gene for homosexuality? Is there a gene for criminal behavior?
Yes.
What do you make of all this?
Yes, that is true, and it really comes back to what we were talking about earlier when you talked about nature or nurture, and I said you can only really talk about genes for variation in things. So you can't say there's a gene for intelligence or a gene for mathematics. What you can say is that there are a gene, or probably several genes. The difference between having it and not having it makes a difference between having the mathematical ability and not having the mathematical ability. So what the genes are for is really only variation, differences between individuals. Mathematical ability is much too complicated to be determined by a gene. But the difference between somebody being brilliant at maths and somebody who isn't could be the result of a single, well, almost certainly isn't, but could be the result of a single gene.
So there's no excuse to say, well, my mother was bad at maths, I'm no good at it, I can't
No, you can sort of, I mean, I wouldn't quite do it as bluntly as that, but you could say that if say if your mother was very good at maths and one of her children was bad and one of them was good, it wouldn't be totally fanciful to wonder whether one of you got a gene from her and the other one didn't, because there you're talking about differences, and you know that any one gene in your mother has a 50% chance of ending up in each child, and so there are. I mean, it is a fact that 50% of your genes come from your mother, and if your mother happens to be good at music or mathematics, then you're lucky to have got particular genes that might have equipped you to be good at music or mathematics.
The selfish gene was a sensational success. Were you surprised?
Yes. I wanted it to appeal to a wide audience. That's why I wrote it, and I jokingly referred to it while writing it as my bestseller.
Before it was?
Long before it was, yes. Yeah.
But so the idea is now current that we know about genes, we know about the genome, and there's a copy of it in the Wilson Foundation. So, has it been misunderstood? Is it used to talk about the survival of particular types of people, or indeed political parties, or political movements, or social groupings? And is that legitimate?
It's much misunderstood and much abused, and with hindsight, it's possible the title was unfortunate, because the selfish gene, when mulling it over the book, I went with a couple of early chapters to see Tom Mashler, who's a very distinguished publisher. And I think he quite liked the chapters that I showed him, but he said, you can't use that title. It's got to be called The Immortal Gene. And The Immortal Gene would have been a very suitable title. I mean, one of the chapters is very largely about the immortal gene. And that has a much more sort of Carl Sagan-esque ring to it, a much more poetic ring to it. And it might have been a better idea because the selfish gene gives the wrong idea that either it's saying that people are selfish, or even worse, that people ought to be selfish. And I was rather disconcerted to discover that my book was taken up by sort of extreme Thatcherite political advocates, which is a total misunderstanding. I mean, it's genes that are selfish, not individuals. The selfish gene gives rise to the altruistic individual. The altruistic individual works for the selfish gene. Well, you have to read the book to get what that means. But I mean, it's a total misunderstanding to think that it's either saying that people are selfish or ought to be selfish. Another misunderstanding is the sort of social Darwinism one.
You mean the kind of theories that greed is good, we're born to be greedy, so get on with it and triumph over your fellow man and grind.
Yes, that's right. And around the turn of the 19th to 20th centuries, people like John D. Rockefeller took up Darwinism as a justification for their ruthless capitalistic.
Yes.
Yeah.
You don't mean that at all.
Yeah.
Shall we have some lights and some questions? I can't see anyone to ask yet, but we've got microphones. Can we have the lights up? Can you see anyone to offer the microphone? We'll take 2 questions at a time. Right, one here. Thank you very much for those lights. Yes, so one question.
Hi, thanks for the talk. You obviously have great respect for Darwin. Do you think that the Welshman Alfred Russel Wallace has had a hard time and has been forgotten down the ages?
It's a very good point. Wallace was a fair bit younger than Darwin. Wallace undoubtedly had the same idea, and people have sometimes argued that it wasn't quite the same. I think it was almost exactly the same. Wallace, as you know, had the idea while out in the Far East. He was just recovering from malaria, and so he was somewhat delirious, and during one of his lucid moments in between spells of fever, he remembered reading Malthus on population, which gave him the idea for natural selection, the idea that overpopulation leads to competition, which leads to selection. He made the analogy between artificial selection and natural selection, everything the same as Darwin, even to the point that Darwin, some 15 years earlier, had also got the idea from reading Malthus. So Wallace undoubtedly deserves equal credit for thinking of natural selection. There's no doubt that Darwin thought of it first, but Darwin, weirdly, I think, sat on the idea for years, decades, well, about 15 years, until prompted into action by receiving a letter from Wallace showing that Wallace had got there as well. Why Darwin sat on it for so long is one of the great mysteries in the history of science.
I've always understood it was because his wife was so devout.
Well, that's one theory. His wife was very devout, and he probably was, in fact, we know he was somewhat nervous of the repercussions.
But he was also a believer himself, wasn't he?
No.
Not quite. Just in the last sentence, the last line of the
well,
book.
as a young man, he was being educated for the clergy, but by the time
that was it.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that there are other ideas for why Darwin sat on it. One was that he was a perfectionist, and he wanted to get all his evidence, all his ducks in a row, as people say. He wanted to get all the evidence assembled. I would have thought, having had a brilliant idea like that, people have said it's the greatest idea ever to occur to a human mind, to sit on it for 15 years rather than worry that somebody's going to scoop you, seemed to me to be shown undue confidence.
The question over here, microphone. Somebody got a... Yes.
Relative to your books on religion, I'm a Christian minister, and many of my colleagues I would be perfectly happy to remove all supernatural elements from beliefs about God, Jesus, the Bible, creeds, and so on. I also have many friends who call themselves secular Jews. So, what do you think if I and people like me described ourselves as secular Christians rather than atheists?
I would describe myself as a secular Christian in the same sort of way as your secular Jew friends, in the sense that they have a feeling of nostalgia for Jewish traditions and ceremonies and things like that. But when you say you and your friends have no belief in anything supernatural, then it's not clear what's left if you are a Christian minister. If you don't believe in anything supernatural, you are an atheist.
You can believe in the life and teaching of Christ.
Yes, you can, and you can believe in the life and teaching of Confucius and Buddha and all sorts of other, and moral philosophers, all sorts of other people like that. But if you take out the supernatural, then it's not clear to me why you would call yourself a minister. And it's also a fact that the great majority of people who call themselves Christians or Muslims actually do believe in the supernatural. And the main reason why they call themselves Christians or whatever they call themselves is because they are impressed by the supernatural stories. They're impressed by miracles. So yes, I'm a secular Christian, if you want to call me that, but I prefer not to call myself that because I think it's misleading those vast multitudes of people who actually are supernaturalists.
Let's talk about paths taken in life, because with the publication of The God Delusion, your career sort of swerved heavily in the direction of programs about atheism, encounters with Christian lobbies, quotations here, debates there. And your whole emphasis of your life for a while was consumed by the arguments surrounding the God illusion. Am I right, do you think?
It's
God
not
delusion.
as big a swerve as you might think, actually, because given that my science is evolutionary science, and given that it's only probably a minority of religious believers who are enlightened as our friend over there and obviously, accepts evolution totally. In America, something like 45% of the electorate not only don't believe in evolution, but think the world is only 6,000 years old. So to be an evolutionary scientist is to be brought up short, head on. Yes. You have to confront the fact that there is a very, very strong active lobby, especially in America, which is doing its damnedest to subvert your science. And so I think it's not as big a swerve as you suggest.
No, I accept that. But do you think that it's an act of defense of the purity of your science against a lot of what you believe is misleading information that has got a handle on the publicity?
That's about half the motivation for me. I mean, there is another part as well, which is in the God delusion, which is, a moral part as well.
Right. Question over here.
Hello, good afternoon. I'd just like to ask if man's ability to run long distances was an evolutionary turning point and why we are now bipedal.
Well, why we're bipedal is a very interesting question. It may have been the forerunner to all sorts of other things. We became bipedal before our brains developed beyond the stage of the other apes. So if you look at our common ancestor with chimpanzees, it probably was much like a chimpanzee. And then down the pathway that led to us, the first thing that changed was that we became bipedal. Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, was a bipedal animal living about 3 million years ago, and she had a brain about the size of a chimpanzee. And then the brain started to swell after that, and it may be that going bipedal was a precursor to the brain blowing up like a balloon. Why we went bipedal, there are lots of different theories of that. There's a very good book by Jonathan Kingdon, who's a great artist as well as a zoologist, on why we went bipedal, and I recommend that book. There are lots of different theories. One that I wondered about suggesting myself, I think I mentioned it in one of my books, is that it could have been sexual selection. I'm not just saying I believe it, but sexual selection is Darwin's other theory. Darwin's pointed out that the way you pass, the way you become a successful reproducer is not just to survive, it's also to be good at reproducing, and that may be being sexually attractive. So something like a peacock's tail is an organ for attracting peahens, an organ for attracting females. And the thing about sexual selection is that it doesn't go in obvious directions. It's not utilitarian. So something like being bipedal in order to run fast, anybody can understand that. But what about being bipedal as something sexually attractive? Now that doesn't sound immediately plausible, but the point about sexual selection is that it goes in arbitrary directions. The theory of sexual selection suggests that if a majority, let's talk about males being attracted to females, but because that's the way it normally goes. If a majority of females, for one reason or another, for whatever reason you like, happens to admire males who are good at standing on their hind legs, and chimpanzees stand on their hind legs quite a lot, they just don't do it all the time. So if you imagine an ancestor which was most of the time quadrupedal, but occasionally rose up on its hind legs, I don't know, to beat the chest or
and all the women came running.
Yes. We don't have to come up with a reason why that was attractive. It's sufficient, according to the mathematical theory, it's sufficient that a majority of females, for whatever reason, found it attractive. Once you get that condition, then you get a kind of runaway process whereby the sons of males who were good at standing up were good at standing up. And the daughters of males who were good at standing up inherited from their mothers the tendency to like males who stand up. And so that kind of that joint selection is what may well have led to peacock's tails, and it's conceivable that something like that could have led to bipedality. That's a rather far-fetched theory, a poor one, but mine own.
Well, it's rather interesting, actually, because it's counterintuitive now, because now that we're all living longer, the fact that we only stand on 2 feet means we've all got back trouble, hip trouble, leg trouble. Right. So actually, it's not enormously beneficial in that respect. Another characteristic of the human being. A question over here. We got someone with a microphone. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have 2 quotations which are going to lead to my question. The first quotation: I am life which wills to live in the midst of life which wills to live. The other quotation from one of my own countrymen: the force that through the green fuse drives the flower, drives my green age, drives also me. My question is it not this force, this will, is it not an intention that influences the genes, not that the genes are the influence? The
intention.
Instigator is not the gene, it is the intention, the will to become, to live.
Well, I like the poetic thought. I couldn't actually hear all of it because of the rain, but I think I got the drift of it. Who were the quotations from? Schweitzer, okay. Who was the other one?
I didn't hear. Who's the second one?
I never mind. It doesn't matter. I like the poetic thought. It doesn't make much biological sense, unfortunately, because there is no force that drives life apart from the natural selection of genes, which is what makes our brains what they are, what makes evolution, what drives evolution in the direction that it has. Now, that kind of poetic imagery actually works rather well for genes, because there is, as I said before, an immortality about genes. Genes really are the force, if you like, which passes down through not just a few generations, but actually millions of generations. And the genes that we all have in us are genes that have made it through those millions of generations. And they made it through those millions of generations because they had what it takes to pass through those generations. Now, the force of will, the sort of force that I think your poetic quotations were referring to, is an emergent property that comes from brains which have been put together by the natural selection of genes.
Does the phrase free will have any meaning for you?
I hate the free will question. I never know how to deal with it. Philosophers are obviously, for very good reason, much exercised by it. It's not a thing that is, it's not a question which is illuminated by a genetic discussion any more than it's illuminated by any kind of physicalist discussion of what's going on in the brain. If you are a determinist who thinks that everything you do is determined by past physical events in the brain and elsewhere, then you're going to be a determinist whether or not genes are involved. So we don't add anything to the discussion by talking about genetic determinism. You are a determinist or not a determinist, depending upon your philosophical position. And I think I am one, but not for genetic reasons.
But when it comes to human behavior, about which we have to be concerned both individually and socially, do we have the excuse to say, I can't help it, I'm the product of my genes?
It would be, I think, a mistake if courts of law were to allow...
well, it does come up, doesn't it?
were to allow the accused to say, "My lad, I did it, but it wasn't my fault, it was me genes." It doesn't make any difference to the theory of justice, to the theory of punishment.
No, but nonetheless, that kind of concept has been raised in courts of law before.
I think it probably has, and probably will until lawyers get their heads around it.
But I mean, people talk about criminal families, don't they?
Yes, they do.
And the mafia, to name but several. There is a mafia gene.
Well, I think in the mafia's case, it's rather more a cultural tradition.
But they do marry each other, and
yes.
Right, question. Oh, one over there, good.
Yeah, Professor Dawkins, thank you. You said in The Greatest Show on Earth that 43% of Americans believe that the world was created more or less as it is today, sometime in the last 10,000 years. My question is, well, it's twofold really. A, why does it matter? And B, what do you think should be done about it?
It matters for me because truth matters. And so I think it would be tragic if children were brought up to believe that the earth was flat. I think it'd be tragic if they were brought up to believe that, all the sorts of things that historically people did believe. There is something beautiful, something wonderful about the truth. And one of the most beautiful and wonderful things about the truth is that we now know the age of the world, just over 4.5, between 4.5 and 4.6 billion years. We know that all living creatures on this planet that have ever been looked at are cousins, sharing ancestors. We know that we are rather close cousins of chimpanzees, slightly more distant cousins of monkeys, more distant cousins still of aardvarks, and you can go on looking at more and more distant cousins still of octopuses. That's a wonderful thought, something that no child should be deprived of. We understand how the process comes about. We understand why we're here. These are all things which enrich life. And so if there are 43% of Americans who believe not just the falsehood, but a palpable and ridiculous falsehood that the world is only 10,000 years old, a belief which I've calculated is equivalent to believing that the width of North America is 8 yards.
what to do about it was the second.
What to do about it? Well, I hate to quote Tony Blair, but education, education, education. It is very sad that science education is actively subverted, in America especially, by parents, by school boards, these democratic elected boards who control syllabuses and things, and that indirectly controls publication of textbooks. Textbooks in America are quite frequently pretty much censored, not by government, of course, but by publishers who are afraid their books won't sell if they put the word evolution in the book. And so they use various sort of euphemisms like dissent with modification and things like that.
But there's a lot of teaching of the designer, the idea of the designed world.
Yes, there is.
Do you disapprove of that?
Of course I do.
I mean, do you think it should just not be taught? Because if it's widely believed, should we know that it's widely believed?
Well, I think it's important to know what is widely believed, and so in classes on religion, in classes on history of ideas, and so on, then by all means teach all the strange ideas that people have and that the children might meet. But in science, we should be teaching the best that science has to offer, and that includes how to think about things. It includes how to do science. It doesn't mean you just give the children a list of facts. It means you teach them how to think about science, how scientists come to the conclusions that they do, tentatively, and then with increasing confidence by testing hypotheses and so on. So there is a place for teaching ridiculous ideas which are widely held, but don't teach them in the science class.
So, do you think that science, teaching, access to truth can improve the human race? Is the human race on some progressive pathway?
Any sort of education of what's true is improving more or less by definition, yes.
And where are we along that pathway?
Well, we're a great many people are doing quite well, but quite a lot aren't. And
some of them are fighting each other.
Yes, that's true. I mean, there are many parts of the world where it is extremely difficult for evolution to be taught, and I get letters from Turkey, letters from Saudi Arabia, letters from Iran, where, to varying extents, it's clear that education is being subverted, and I'm sorry to say, even in this country, where one can visit schools which are of a largely Muslim character, where the science teachers pay lip service to evolution because it's part of the syllabus, but they make it very clear to the children this is not what they are supposed to believe.
Question? Yes?
Hello, thank you. I wanted to ask you, if the purpose of humankind is to procreate, why don't women die earlier when they have the menopause? Why don't we die earlier? I've had this question many years ago, but I heard a few months ago that there's a theory that says that probably grandmothers used to help the pregnant mother to gather food or hunt. Do you believe this theory could be plausible, or do you have another theory?
Well, I think it is quite a plausible idea, because if you think about the amount of good that a woman can do to a child, which might be her child or it might be her grandchild, then if the viability of the child, if she has a baby when she's relatively old, it may be that the chance of the child surviving becomes less because she's old, and therefore, although she is twice as closely related to her child as she would be to her grandchild, nevertheless, the amount of benefit she can do to her genes by taking care of her grandchildren might exceed the amount of benefit she can do to her genes by bearing yet another child. So there could be a kind of crossover point, a sort of break-even point, where the woman's best genetic interest is served by ceasing to reproduce herself and instead putting all her effort into looking after grandchildren. So I do think it's quite plausible.
What about the developing science which is allowing women in their 50s and indeed into their 60s to bear children by the manipulation of science?
Well, that of course is a
social,
very, very wonderful thing for the people, for the families concerned, but it's not really an evolutionary question because it's a very artificial. Yes.
Right. Question over here.
Yes, thank you. I keep coming across this troubling notion of transhumanism. The idea that with technology, eventually by the year 2045, human consciousness will be capable of being uploaded into a computer or whatever, and then diffuse around the universe. It comes from people like Ray Kurzweil of Google, Nick Bostrom of Oxford. I just wondered what your views on this were. Is it insanity or the next stage of human evolution?
The border between science fiction and legitimate science speculation is a hazy one. I'm quite fond of science fiction. I'm quite fond of the sort of science fiction which is informed by science and the sort of futurological speculation which merges into science fiction. I would put it into that category. Transhumanism is used for lots of things, including just extending human life by improved medical procedures, but also more far-fetchedly by uploading the human brain contents into a computer. That's much more speculative, and it actually gives rise to strange philosophical paradoxes, which philosophers do discuss interestingly. Like if I upload my entire brain in some future century, I could upload my brain contents into a computer, so there are two copies of me, so to speak, one in here and one in the computer. Both of them think that they're me. You get into all sorts of philosophical dilemmas, which, I mean, I recommend some of the philosophical literature. Dan Dennett, for example, has written a lovely paper based on a lecture that he gave once called Where Am I?, in which he actually announces to the audience that his brain has been uploaded into a computer and that there are two copies of him, and that both of them are in control of his body, but alternately one or other of them at any one time is in control of his body. And he's got a little switch on his belt which enables him to switch from his brain, which actually is in a vat somewhere, and
now, is this in a linear? Is there a logic moving towards that, or is?
Well, I mean, that is the logic of the
story.
The questioner was asking. But the philosophical, interesting question is, as Dan said, where am I? Which one am I? Which of these two? Anyway, he's got this switch here, which enables him to. He says that just at present, I forget which one I'm on. Actually, I think maybe I'm in the computer, maybe I'm in the vat. I'll just switch it. It won't make any difference. And he switches the thing, and he says, "Thank goodness you did that. I've been waiting for you to do that," and so on. You read it; it's very good.
What about AI, intelligent robots now, about to overtake us in their capacities?
Yes, the progress in artificial intelligence is slower than many people predicted some decades ago when I first started looking into this. There are plenty of programs that sound intelligent, and even your iPhone, Kiri, you can ask Kiri questions, and she gives, on her good days, what sound like quite intelligent answers. It's philosophically interesting when, if ever, these intelligent programs will have subjective consciousness to the point where we'll feel moral scruples about turning them off and that kind of thing.
Well, they might feel that they could turn us off.
Yes, that might be a good thing.
We've only a couple of minutes to go, so one final question, yes?
Hi. So you mentioned that the way we should think about genes is in terms of giving us variation, but there is a geographical distribution to the versions of genes that we all have, and Nicholas Wade has recently written a book putting that in context of race, which has become very provocative. So I wondered what your view of race is.
It's a very controversial topic, of course, and there has been a kind of orthodoxy that's grown up over the last few decades, which says that there is no such thing as race. And it's based upon the observation that partly the human species is genetically very uniform. The total genetic variation in the entire human population is smaller than for many other species, suggesting that we may have passed through a bottleneck not that long ago, like cheetahs, not such a narrow bottleneck as cheetahs. And much of the variation is across the whole of the human population, rather than separating one so-called race from another. From this, people have tried to argue that there is no such thing as race. There's no such thing as geographically separated populations, or geographically localized populations, which can be distinguished genetically. That's got to be false, because we know perfectly well that if you were to take a typical person from Uganda, from China, from Greenland, from Norway, etc., anybody in the world would be perfectly capable of saying which one came from which place. So there is a correlation, a genetic correlation, which between people within a particular geographical location, which we call race. That has been controversial, and one of the things that Nicholas Wade has been concerned to undo is that orthodoxy. And I think that's right. I think he's right in that. What's a bit more controversial is that he's suggesting that these different geographical races have become different because of different natural selection pressures in the different areas. So I think we've got to accept that there are geographical differences. The question is, are they due to natural selection? Nicholas Wade thinks they are, at least to some extent, and he's got a lot of stick for that. And I think the jury's probably out.